Hi, this is documentary filmmaker John Ziegler. I run the website framingpaterno.com. The framing is figurative, not literal. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm in the basement of the home of Jerry and Dottie Sandusky, a place that became rather infamous, although I do not believe that it should have been because of testimony during the trial. As you can see, it's just a normal basement with memorabilia, a air hockey, a rather old air hockey playing field. We've got a dartboard, a pool table, a couple of other games, nothing special, weird, or anything particularly nefarious. There's a room just to my left, which is a spare bedroom, from which you can hear almost anything, not only upstairs, but even on the second floor of this rather small home in State College, Pennsylvania. And the testimony that made this place infamous is completely absurd, and it was made by a victim who came into this case after Joe Paterno was fired, after Penn State basically said, okay, Fort Knox is wide open, come on in, trial lawyers, and have fun, just try to leave the place as it was when you leave with our money. And that particular victim, number 9, who absurdly claims that he and Joe Paterno and Jerry Sandusky had lunch together at Beaver Stadium well after Jerry retired, is just flat out lying. And he was the one who claimed that he was screaming in this basement and that Dottie was in the house and that she never heard him or did anything, which is absurd on every level. And that's part of why Dottie Sandusky and myself agreed to do an interview today with Matt Lauer in her home. Dottie is key to this case, not just because she is Jerry Sandusky's wife, and obviously any wife who has known somebody as closely as she has known Jerry for 38 years would be an important character witness, but obviously she was here most of the time where a lot of the allegations took place, and 2 of the key victims, number 4 and number 9, put her at the scene of the crimes. So she has to be lying for them not to have blatantly perjured themselves, which I believe they did in both those cases, because having interacted with Dottie Sandusky for over a year now, rather extensively, I can assure you that it is the thing that I am most positive of in this entire case, and that is that even after the trial, 2.5 years after the arrest, that after all of the media firestorm, after everything, Dottie Sandusky is positive in her own mind that Jerry Sandusky is innocent. That is an absolute stone cold hard fact. And that's a fact that's important. It's not just somebody standing by their man or somehow pursuing their self-interest, although frankly I've always thought it would have been more in Dottie's self-interest to throw Jerry under the bus. She would be perceived publicly far better if she threw Jerry Sandusky under the bus. But not only has she not done that, she drives 3 hours and 15 minutes each way every single week, come hell or high water, to go visit him alone in prison where she can't even touch him. There is zero, and I mean zero doubt that she knows that he is innocent. And so I've been trying to get her to speak for about a year, and finally the circumstances all came together to do that. There was a lot of different parts to this puzzle, and getting Matt Lauer to come here to tape an interview was not easy. It was rather extraordinary because we could not do a live interview because of the nature of Dottie's lack of experience with a live interview and all the risk that that entails. But of course, when you tape an interview, you're also giving an awful lot of power to a media outlet that, frankly, like every other media outlet, has had an extraordinary agenda in this case. So I have gotten in writing and via eye-to-eye, man-to-man contact with Matt Lauer, as well as his producers, that this entire interview that we did today is going to be shown permanently in a link on the NBC News website. I certainly expect and hope that they're going to adhere to that agreement, because that was a large part of why I agreed to let Matt Lauer come here and interview myself and Dottie Sandusky together. I also have a tape of the entire interview itself, which I'll make public if need be. I'm hoping and trusting that NBC will adhere to the agreement that they made, and that all of this about hour-long interview will eventually or simultaneously appear on the website with the airing of the edited version of this interview, which will occur on Wednesday, March the 12th on the Today Show, barring some sort of major breaking news. Now, Matt Lauer himself during the interview was, I thought, as he always is, he was very professional, well-informed, sharp in his questioning, knowing exactly what he wanted. He's tough. I mean, he's not easy to get the best of. He was not belligerent. He was not unfair. There were a couple things I wish he would have done differently, but that was inevitable. But overall, I thought Matt Lauer did a good job. How it will be edited, I'm skeptical, as everyone should be in this case, knowing the nature of the news media agenda in it. But based upon my conversations with those who will be in charge, I have faith that they will be fair. And if they are fair, what people are going to see is that Dottie Sandusky is positive her husband is innocent, and that there is an evidentiary path to that happening. She is not delusional. She's not stupid. She knows the case better than most media members do. So what is the path? How could this have happened? What is the path to Jerry Sandusky getting railroaded? And when I went on the Today Show the first time after I interviewed Jerry Sandusky in prison, I didn't see that path. So I presumed he had to be at least partially guilty. But now I see that path very, very clearly. And the path actually makes a heck of a lot more sense logically than the story that we were told. Because the story we were told really doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. The story we were told is based in the notion that a bunch of teenage boys would put up with varying degrees of sexual abuse, some of it not nearly as severe as the media perception. Some of the allegations in the initial indictments were really somewhat ambiguous, and including the first allegation from 1998 is extremely ambiguous, which was why it was investigated and found to be quote-unquote unfounded by law enforcement. But the reality is that these allegations, I believe, came about in a way that's very, very different than what is perceived to be the case. And you need to go back to the beginning to understand why this rush to judgment, not just a rush to judgment, a flying leap to judgment off a cliff occurred. And it really all goes back to that first week of this story. People need to understand the evolution of this and how there became a symbiotic relationship in the railroading of Jerry Sandusky and the railroading of Joe Paterno. If the Penn State Board of Trustees does not wet themselves on November 9, 2011, panic, and fire Joe Paterno in the way that they did, and essentially fire the president of the university, Graham Spanier, in the way that they did, then these dominoes do not fall in the way that this case created. And I believe that Jerry Sandusky, in all likelihood, would be a free man today. By the way, under that scenario, I think there's a good chance we haven't even had the trial yet, because this trial was over 7 months after the arrest, which is insane when you consider the fact that those who are being accused of the cover-up of these crimes, who are, I believe, unjustly being charged, they haven't even had their trial yet 2.5 years later, and there's no sign that they're going to have their trial anytime soon. So what happened here was, because of 3 words in a grand jury presentment dealing with the allegation in the Mike McQueary situation or episode, which were totally and flatly false, that Jerry Sandusky had been seen committing anal intercourse, anal rape with a 10 or 11-year-old boy by Mike McQueary, that is what started all of this domino effect, all of this snowball down the mountain that became an avalanche. That was false. It was totally false. Even Mike McQueary has never said that, and Jerry Sandusky was acquitted of that particular charge. So when the Penn State Board of Trustees panics in the midst of this media firestorm and fires Paterno and Spanier, that is seen as a guilty plea on behalf of Jerry Sandusky by Penn State University. Because after all, why would Penn State fire Joe Paterno and Graham Spanier, the president, if they didn't know that Jerry Sandusky was guilty? Well, they didn't know Jerry Sandusky was guilty, because no one had investigated it at that point objectively. And the evidence against him at that time was pathetic. There were only 6 accusers on that day, only 2 of which claimed actual sex, many of whom knew each other. And the 2 that claim sex have huge problems with their story. But the firing of Paterno creates a nuclear explosion. And now all of a sudden, Penn State is seen as pleading guilty on behalf of Paterno and Spanier, and obviously on behalf of Sandusky. A couple of days later, there's a huge candlelight vigil at Penn State for the victims. The victims become sanctified immediately. And beyond reproach, you can't even question them. And people are having in their minds that the Mike McQueary allegation, or at least how that was reported, is what all the other accusers are saying. It's not even close to what all the other accusers were saying. Not even close. Even their worst accusations were nothing close to what people misperceive happened in the Mike McQueary episode. So now we have the nuclear explosion. And the perfect storm begins, not only begins to build, it is building at full force. Because what happens is all of the people who should have been Jerry Sandusky's biggest supporters, all the people who knew him best, all the people who actually had an incentive to defend him, not only are gone, they hate him. They hate him worse than just a normal pedophile because he's the pedophile that brought down Joe Paterno. So Jerry Sandusky goes from being someone who would have had a presumption of innocence to having no presumption of innocence. There's a presumption of guilt. He has no supporters. He has no money. His defense team is completely overwhelmed. They were not expecting what came down in the indictments. They thought they had the situation handled during the 3-year grand jury investigation, which produced only 2 people who sort of claimed they had sex with Jerry Sandusky. The reason it took 3 years was not because there was a hesitation to indict him that was corrupt. It was because there was no damn evidence. That's why it took 3 years to indict and arrest Jerry Sandusky. And so now we have this symbiotic relationship in the railroading of Jerry Sandusky and the railroading of Joe Paterno. The rush to judgment against Sandusky causes the railroading of Joe Paterno. The railroading of Joe Paterno creates a nuclear explosion, which makes it impossible for Jerry Sandusky to get a fair trial. The trial is over in 7 months. In 7 months, it's over. The trial was a joke. Jerry Sandusky was convicted of 9 counts in which there was no known victim. He was convicted of 5 counts in which there was no known victim, no direct witness, no date given for the event, and no contemporaneous report of the event. That is scary for anybody who believes in due process. But it's over in 7 months. The media, instead of testing the case and standing up for due process, gets out their pom-poms and they're cheerleading for the case. This is the exact opposite of what occurred, of course, in the O.J. Simpson case. I believe that the Jerry Sandusky case is the inverse of the O.J. Simpson case. In O.J., you had massive amounts of evidence, a media that pretended he might be innocent because they knew it was great for ratings and they were afraid of the race issue. You had a judicial system that wanted to bend over backwards for the defendant to show how great our system is. We could still convict a guy even though we gave him every benefit of the doubt. And then you had a jury who thought it was their civic duty to acquit him, probably because of the race issue. Well, in the Jerry Sandusky case, you had the exact opposite. Unlike O.J., you didn't have a mountain of evidence, you had a molehill of evidence that was treated like the news media as if it was a mountain. And the news media got their pom-poms out for the case. Penn State essentially pled guilty on Sandusky's behalf. Everyone presumes he must be guilty. The fiasco of the Bob Costas interview, which is misunderstood, doesn't help. And the reality is that the judicial system gave the defendant no benefit of the doubt. Not one continuance, not one, which is unheard of in a case like this. Every ruling went against the defense. Some of the things the judge did were absurd. And the reality is that the jury, understandably, thought it was their civic duty to convict Jerry Sandusky because their community had been accused of covering up for a pedophile to protect football. And they all knew it was their job to convict Jerry Sandusky. And they did it. And they probably believe they did the right thing. By the way, a lot of the victims probably think they did the right thing. Because once the nuclear explosion happens, now all of a sudden everyone's presuming, well, not everybody could possibly be wrong about this. Oh my gosh, Jerry really is a pedophile. Now all of a sudden, you know, Jerry being a touchy-feely guy gets interpreted totally differently, especially when Penn State is saying, here's the blank check, please tell me what your name is and what bank account you would like this wired to, which is essentially what they were doing for anybody. And I'm stunned that there weren't more victims that came forward under those circumstances. I mean, the notion, when you consider that Jerry was interacting with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of at-risk kids who could have come forward if there was any even hint of an allegation, and who did not, is stunning. When they were all getting paid $2 million to do this with almost no questions asked. And then, of course, once Jerry Sandusky is convicted, the railroading of Joe Paterno in Penn State continues, because now, and we have emails to prove this, that the Attorney General's office and Louis Freeh were in communication, and Louis Freeh was ready to pounce. Once he got the conviction, whammo! Then comes the Freeh report on the slowest news day of the year in 2012 during the All-Star break during baseball. And then right after that, with record speed, the NCAA comes down with unprecedented and illogical sanctions, and Penn State is basically put on a temporary death penalty. Joe Paterno's statue is taken down, and in the public consciousness, of course, this is all cemented. Because how could this possibly all happen? How could everybody get it wrong? I'm now of the belief that it was impossible for anyone to get it right, including myself. That's because of the perfect storm here. Think about this, folks. The sports media has a horrific history of getting stories wrong. Duke lacrosse, Mark McGuire, Sammy Sosa, A-Rod, Lance Armstrong, Tiger Woods, Manti Te'o. These were all easy stories to get correct. They blew them all horrendously. This one was tough. This was like doing calculus in a hurricane. These are not qualified people, the news media members. They all thought someone else did the math. That's what they thought. They thought, well, I don't need to do the math here on this case because someone else did it. Not everyone could possibly be wrong. Well, guess what? Everyone relied on Penn State to do the math those first 4 days of the story. And Penn State didn't get the math just a little bit wrong. They got the math totally wrong. And no one checked the math. So the original part of the story, the original part of this mathematical equation was wrong. And everything else after it was built on that first miscalculation of the math. And that I am positive of. Do I know exactly what the interaction between Jerry Sandusky and every one of these accusers is? Obviously not. But there is no evidence that is remotely credible that Jerry Sandusky was having sex acts with a boy. And the reality is that the totality of this narrative makes a hell of a lot more sense. A hell of a lot more sense under my scenario than it does under the narrative we were given. And the narrative we were given was that these teenage boys, now some of them old, in their 20s, decided to put up with sex acts or abusive acts in the realm of sex. Why? Because a retired assistant football coach was willing to take them to an occasional Penn State football game. That's why they didn't say anything to anybody. Didn't leave a breadcrumb. Didn't leave a hint. Not one contemporaneous report. Not to a friend. Not to a parent, a guardian, a teacher, coach. Not a joke. Nothing. Not one thing up until investigators come to them. And it's almost all of it comes after the Mike McQueary allegation. Investigators and prosecutors used Mike McQueary and Aaron Fisher, victim number 1, as the two bedrocks, the pillars of this case. We were told those pillars were steel in November of 2011. Sarah Ganim told us so. She won the Pulitzer Prize, which was a joke, cementing Jerry Sandusky's guilt on November 8th of 2011 in an article that was an embarrassment, which would end up winning her a Pulitzer Prize, which was an embarrassment to the Pulitzer people. But those two pillars were not made of steel. They were made of sand. McQueary did not see an assault, and he's not credible. Aaron Fisher was not believed for 2 years during the grand jury. That's why there was no indictment. He was the primary victim and the only real witness of any kind of a sex act. He's not credible. I've investigated him thoroughly. The defense wasn't even worried that much about him. And that's why there was no indictment. Well, once those two pillars disintegrate, which in my mind they have, the rest of this case is suspect because it was those two pillars that the prosecution and investigators used to go to other people and say, we have a victim who says Jerry subjected him to sex continually. We have a football coach who says he saw Jerry involved in a sex act in a Penn State shower. Once you have those two things, of course people are going to change their perception about somebody like Jerry Sandusky, who's touchy-feely, he's old school, he looks at the world differently, he's a little goofy, a little weird. That's natural. This is why I use the Loch Ness Monster analogy, which I gave to Matt Lauer. I'll be curious to see what they do with that. It probably won't air, but it hopefully will be on the website. I believe this is much like the Loch Ness Monster. That no one thought there was a Loch Ness Monster, which doesn't exist, until people started saying there was one. And then people started seeing shadows and waves and eels differently than they had previously. That's what happened in this case. And by the way, the testimony proves that. The first victim from 1998 basically admits that on the stand. Mike McQueary admits that in December of 2011 when he's asked, did you say to people that Jerry shouldn't be around the program before or after investigators came to you? And he acknowledged it was after. I believe this is what happened to the Mike McQueary victim, who has never said anything other than, Jerry never molested me in any way, shape, or form, especially that particular night, which I remember, and which he gave a statement to, which you can see on our website, framingpaterno.com, which has been up there for a year, where he says nothing ever happened with Jerry. He's never contradicted that. His lawyers have never contradicted that. His behavior doesn't contradict that. He needs to come forward and tell the real truth again, but he's been paid off, so now I don't know that he ever will, whether his conscience will get the best of him. But the reality is, there's no possible way there was an assault that night. But it was those two pillars, McQueary and Fisher, that the prosecution and investigators used to fool other people into believing that Jerry was capable of this. And then all of a sudden, touchy-feely, the line between touchy-feely and maybe something that seems like sexual abuse, the bar of which is far, far lower than you were told by the media, is incredibly plausible. Especially when investigators are trying to pull it out of you and you're lawyered up and a lawyer's saying, you sure this didn't happen? Because, you know, this could be good for us. And I mean, it's not that difficult to understand how this could happen. And actually, I'm amazed that the tidal wave wasn't larger when you consider the amount of attention that this case got. And I want to make something very clear. After November 9th, 2011, any accuser that came forward, in my mind, instantaneously has very little credibility. Because at that point, there are 7 months that have gone past since Sarah Gannon put basically a Craigslist ad in the local newspaper advertising for more victims, which she was doing on behalf of the prosecution. She put that in the local newspaper. Everybody knew there was a grand jury investigation. Anybody who was a potential victim knew for 7 months. And then you also have at least 3 or 4 days where it's national news. You know that you're a victim of Jerry Sandusky. He's been arrested now. It's time to come forward if you're real. But after November 9th, everybody knows that Fort Knox is wide open at Penn State. Every trial lawyer knows this is the greatest payday that's ever going to happen. And if you don't come forward by that point, to me, you are inherently lacking in credibility. Well, interestingly, the only 2 victims who testified or came forward after that point were the worst 2 victims with regard to credibility in the entire trial. That's not a coincidence. And those were considered to be the cream of the crop of those who came forward after Joe Paterno was unfairly fired. The story here is not a conspiracy. It's not even difficult to understand. It's not even difficult to comprehend. It took me quite a while to do it because even I was fooled by the media narrative. I thought, my God, there's no way everybody could be wrong. Now I'm thinking, there's no way that the morons who were reporting on this story could have gotten it right. Because it's incredibly complex and difficult until you see the path as I have seen it. And the reason why I see the path is because I'm positive that Dottie Sandusky is telling the truth, that she believes that Jerry is innocent, and she has to be lying for Jerry to be anything close to what we were told that he was. And so when you watch the Today Show interview, no matter how they edit it, that's the #1 thing that you should get out of this. Somebody, please explain how it is that Jerry can be the monster that he's portrayed as and Dottie not to know it. Because she has to know it, and she doesn't, and she's not lying. So I ask, watch the interview with an open mind. It'll be on Wednesday, March 12th, on the Today Show, the edited version. I am told that the entire interview, I was promised, again in writing, that the entire interview will be on NBC's website permanently, simultaneous with that airing. I am going to be very interested and, of course, skeptical to see how it is edited. But Dottie did a great job. She did an incredibly good job under difficult circumstances. It was a risky endeavor, but it was the chance that we had to take because when you're in a desperate situation and you have no leverage, and because of the media bias in this case, we have no leverage. It was a miracle to get Matt Lauer to come to State College to tape this. It was a long shot, but it was a shot we had to take, and it was a shot we did our best in trying to execute. I'll of course comment on what NBC does with it at the proper time, but for now, I wanted you to be updated on what transpired, why we did it, why I feel so strongly about this, and why I'm willing to take the incredible risk and the enormous amount of criticism I know I will receive to tell you what I truly believe is the truth here. Because the truth has got to still matter. It has not mattered since day one in this case. I don't know if it ever will, but what I'm telling you is closer to the truth than anybody else will. And I hope you'll look at that with an open mind. Thank you for watching. Check out framingpaterno.com for more information.